morning, everybody, and welcome to the CCNA Bootcamp. My name is Brian McGann, and I'm going to be the instructor for this class. A little bit about myself. I'm from Chicago, and I've been in networking for about 15 years now. And I originally started in Microsoft networking, doing like just desktop support and PC support, and then I got into like Windows Server type stuff. Went through the MCSE in NT4, which is quite a while now, probably 15 years. And then eventually that led me into CCNA and CCNP. So it definitely was a good basis for the Cisco stuff that I've been into since then. We'll talk about that today. What are the expectations of the level of technologies that we're going to be going through with CCNA, and some of the prerequisites and just recommendations on different resources you can use and stuff like that. But at least for me personally, I thought MCSE was a great prereq for this, because it went over just a lot of general networking theory, and especially like from the application level, what are we really trying to do in the first place with the network. From there, I got CCIE in routing and switching, service provider, and security. And for any questions that you guys have, my address is there. It's bmcgann@ine.com. I'll put this up on the whiteboard later as well. So any questions you have offline during the week or after class, you guys feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy to help you guys out with anything. The only one thing I do want to mention is that the actual CCNA exam, or essentially any of the Cisco exams, there's basically an agreement that you sign that just says don't tell people what the actual questions are. So we're not going to talk about what are the actual questions on the exam, but we'll talk about all the technologies that are within the scope. So pretty much anything is fair game. Feel free to ask me anything you want, whether I'm doing the lectures or whether we're working on lab time. I'm more than happy to answer questions. That's what I'm here for. Now, along with that, class participation is key. So really, the more questions you ask, the more that you're going to get out of class. So if we spend hours and hours every day answering questions, that's fine. I'm more than happy to do that. So like I said, just don't hold back with anything you guys want to ask me. For offline questions, there's a couple resources that we have. One of them is a discussion forum, which is at ieoc.com. And basically this is a combination of a web forum and a mailing list. So for the web forum, you can just go to, and it's under CCIA forums, but it's a lot of other topics as well. So you'll see there's ones for CCNA and just different technology topics. But what's good about this is not only to read and to get involved with the discussions of other people. There's a lot of good information in the archives, because the forum has been up there for going on like 10 years now. So if there's a particular technical topic that you want to get more information on, usually you can go through the search and search for a particular keyword and get some good information on that. There's another one, if you haven't seen this yet, that is the Cisco Learning Network. It is a really good forum for these type of discussions that is a little bit more targeted to this type of level, like CCENT, CCNA, CCNP type level. So there's a lot of good information here. The only one thing I don't like about this one is that you can't reply through email, which is one of the features that our forum has, IEOC. So if you can go through the web and read all the posts and reply there. The advantage with this one, though, is that you can subscribe to the individual lists, and then if you don't want to go on your web browser to reply, you can just reply through your email. The other one is our CCI blog, or basically just our general technology blog. And the URL for this one is blog.ine.com. Main idea for this one is technical write-ups on different topics. Some of it is a little bit more advanced than what we're going to be talking about this week. But if you go to our website, which is ine.com, you'll find links at the bottom. You'll find links for both of them. So this one is going to send you to the blog and then to the online community, IEOC. So we'll talk about this as we go through the different topics throughout the week. What are different resources that you can get access to? Because pretty much 99% of this stuff you could figure out just by going through Cisco's documentation, by going through different online resources. Since this certification's been around for so long, there's so many different resources that are available for it. Now, almost to the point where it can get overwhelming to figure out how do I really narrow down my scope of what I need to learn for this, or even more so, what do I need to learn in order to apply this in the field? So we're going to take, like I mentioned, a little bit more practical approach to these topics, where I will be going through the theory for the topics, which is definitely important to understand, like how do local area networks work, what's the difference between that and a wide area network, how does layer 2 switching work, how does layer 3 IP routing work, but also the configuration. So we're going to go through a lot of practical examples on the Cisco iOS command line and the switches command line. You can also make these changes through a web interface, GUI, which is called the Cisco SDM, which is the Router and Security Device Manager. So we'll look at some examples of using this, which is kind of like a wizard for configuring the routers and the switches to do some of the basic operations. But most of this we're going to spend on the command line interface, which is like a telnet interface where you're typing commands in and then the router and switch is sending you feedback on it. Now, like I mentioned, one of the big problems that I had when I was first learning this stuff is you can read through the documents, you can read through a lot of resources that say, you know, these are the commands you need to enter in order to accomplish this. But then once you do that, how do you know that it's really working? And how do you tie together that theory and the configuration to see how it really fits together? And that's going to be the second two portions we're going to focus on, is verifying all this stuff. So what are the different show commands you can use on the routers and switches? What are the different debug commands that if we run into problems, what are the appropriate ones to use? And then more importantly, how do we read through that output? Because there's not really a lot of good documentation that shows you, if you have this problem, run this show command. Or if you have this problem, run this debug command and then look for these outputs. So we'll go through not only the theory, like I mentioned, how to configure this stuff, and then how to test it to make sure it's actually working. Now, the general outline of class is going to pretty well follow along what the blueprint is for the CCNA exam. And there's basically 3 different variations that you can go through to get the certification. And if you go to cisco.com/go/CCNA, it's going to take you to their main certification page, where it's going to give you information like what is CCNA, why would I want to get this to begin with, what's the syllabus, and then also you'll see here the different exam paths that you can take, which currently is either CCNA as a whole, which is what we're going to be doing this week, or you could take it as 2 separate exams, ICND 1 and ICND 2. So if you look at either of these, or any of these 3, I should say, this one here, the composite exam, basically is the same outline as the other 2, but it's going to be all in one. So here, if you go to Cisco's website and you need to log in, you can create an account if you don't already have one. But then it tells you some just general information about the exam. If you've never taken a Cisco exam before, or never taken another networking exam or IT exam like Microsoft or something similar, then you probably want to spend some time going through the exam tutorial, which just shows you the format of it, like the multiple choice questions, drag and drop questions, just the basic interface of what the exam is actually going to look like. But mainly, what's important here is what are the exam topics. So what are the technologies that we need to talk about within the scope of CCNA? So first and foremost, describe how a network works. This is mainly what we're going to be spending probably the vast majority today, talking about just the general theory of networking. What are the differences between like the OSI model and the TCP/IP model? What are some of the basic differences between like LAN networks and WAN networks, different types of networking protocols? So this is just a more generic thing about networking. Once you get a little bit further in, then we're going to get into the specifics of how Cisco actually implements these technologies. So how do you configure switches? How do VLANs work? How does spanning tree work? Also with IP addressing and IP routing. So we'll talk about things like subnetting, different services for IP like DHCP servers, DNS servers. We'll look at a lot of examples of these. Some of these you'll see specifically it says like configure DHCP and DNS, but then do it both on the command line interface and SDM. So we're going to look at a number of different variations of this. What you may also find is you're getting into a little bit more of the advanced features of this. Let's say, for example, you don't know how DHCP gets configured, but you have a general idea of what is DHCP to begin with. When you're learning this stuff on the command line first, a lot of times it's hard to figure out what are the individual commands you need to do to get this functional. And that's where the SDM really is going to help you a lot. That it's kind of a wizard that just walks you through, what are the different options you need to configure this technology. But then you can kind of work backwards from there. So we'll look at some cases where we go through the web interface of the SDM, but then look at what's the result of the commands that it used on the CLI or the command line interface to actually do that. Next one, configure, verify, troubleshoot basic Cisco router operations. Okay, we'll actually talk about this stuff before we get into the configuration of the other topics, because this is just like, how do you get into the router? What are the different types of connectors you need to use to talk to it? How does the basic iOS interface work, which is going to be for managing the routers and for managing the switches? Then we'll talk about network security a little bit, including access control lists and network address translation, where access lists or ACLs, this is used for security in the network, where network address translation or NAT, this is going to be used for like larger scale implementations of addressing. Then we'll talk a little bit about WAN links, like what are the difference between the frame relay protocol and PPP or HDLC. This isn't really a huge focus of the CCNA curriculum. More they're just trying to get you to figure out what's the difference between where the majority of our topics go, which is in the LAN, and then what's the difference between that and the WAN, and how does that change some of the design and the operation of the network. So it's going to pretty fairly closely follow that along. So today we'll mainly talk about what are the different pieces that make up a network. How does that fit into the different models that they've come up with over the years, and why would you want to even use that to begin with? Okay, this one, the OSI models and the TCP/IP models, I think it's a requirement by law that every book that's written on networking, you have to start the first chapter that talks about the OSI model. So if you've been in networking before, you may have seen this stuff, but in the long run it is actually important, especially when we get into like troubleshooting the network or to look at how do we build the network in a structured fashion. It actually is good a lot of the times to fall back to that layered approach that the OSI or the TCP/IP models define. We'll also talk about some of the different requirements of network applications and then how to interpret network diagrams and try to visualize what should be the end result of our network design, or what should be the end result. Like if I go to browse a web server, from behind the scenes point of view, how does that actually work as it goes through the different devices in the topology or different devices in the network? We'll then talk about the LAN switching, get into some specifics of the configuration of the catalyst switches with Ethernet. Then, as I mentioned, IP addressing. We're going to focus mainly on IP version 4 this week, but we will talk about the newer version of that, which is IP version 6. Then routing is going to be a pretty big focus as well. What are some of the different dynamic routing protocols like RIP, EIGRP, and OSPF? Why would you want to use one versus the other? And how that's going to affect the some of the network design. There is a little bit of focus on wireless for this exam. There is a separate wireless CCNA certification, so it's more just touching on the general idea of what is wireless. Then if you want to get more information on that, they would point you towards the wireless track. Same thing is going to be true with security, where we'll talk about some of the basic requirements of security in networks, but most of that, if you want details on it, you would go towards CCNA security, and then eventually CCNP security, CCIE security. Okay, so again, pretty much pretty close to what's on the blueprint there as well. Now, as I mentioned, everyone is also going to have access to routers and switches to use this week. A little bit later today, we'll talk about specifically how we get into those, what are the applications we need to talk to the routers and switches. But specifically, there's going to be 5 routers that are a mix of 2600 XMs, is the specific hardware platform that we're using, which has both Ethernet and serial interfaces, which we'll talk about in detail. What does that really mean a little bit later. Then there's 3 Catalyst switches, which are 3550 switches, which means they're both layer 2 and layer 3 switches, which we'll get into more detail. What does that mean? What's the difference between layer 2 switching and layer 3 switching? And there's also a test PC that we're going to be using for testing a bunch of different applications. So like TFTP server, web server, DNS, DHCP. So you'll have a better idea of if I was on my laptop here and I browse to a web server, when I look at that from my router configuration and from my switch configuration, what's the end result of it? Because sometimes if you look at just the network on its own, like build a network with just switches, with just routers, you can't really visualize what's the end result. And really the end result is always going to be based on what is the application doing. Because the whole point of the network is to somehow service the applications, whether that's like web browsing or financial data or phone calls that are going over the IP network. Ultimately, what we're worried about is the actual application. So as I mentioned, the rack access is going to be 24/7 availability. So later this evening or anytime throughout the week, if you want to go back through some of these examples, you'll have access to do that as well. Now, some of the resources that we're going to be going through, I want to talk about just some of the recommended readings for after class that you would want to go back through. And then also, we're going to be spending a bunch of time this week on Cisco's website, which if you've spent much time on it before, you'll see it's not very self-explanatory how to actually navigate through it and how to find information on there. But the thing is that there's so many free resources that you can find just by using Cisco's website and by knowing how the information is categorized. Pretty much everything you could need to know is going to be on there. Now, whether it's going to be as neatly written as like these introductory CCNA, like the ICND and ICND2 books, depends on what particular topics we're looking at. But we will spend a bunch of time navigating through the website, looking at how the documentation works. How can you find information about the actual hardware? Like if I'm trying to figure out what kind of router do I need for this application, we'll look at how to go through that as well. Now for recommended readings, ones that are specific to the exam mainly is going to be this one that you see the printed set there, which is the Cisco Press CCNA Certification Library, it's called. And there's actually 2 versions of this. The one that we have is this one here that's by Wendell Odom, who writes a lot of the different titles for Cisco Press. He's a really good author, puts a lot of the stuff into very plain language to make it easy to understand. But basically what this is the 2-book set that covers both the ICND-1 and the ICND-2 exams. Now you'll see that some of this is going to be pointed towards the theory, like what is networking, what are switches, what are routers. But the key is that this is specifically for the exam. So a lot of times you'll see topics that are very specific to passing the exam, not the actual questions, but just the type of specific information that you need for the test. What we're going to be mainly focusing on this week is the technologies, where if you understand the technologies, then you should be able to pass the exam because, regardless of how they format the question, if you really understand how switching works or you really understand how routing works, then it's not really going to be a problem. But this two-book set is really good. There's another one that is the self-study guides, which is kind of similar to this, CCNA self-study. Which I want to say is the CCNA preparation library. So they separate into two different categories, where this one is learning the topics and then this one is preparing for the exam. So the book set that we have here is the one that's specifically geared towards the actual exam. This one here, the preparation library, is a little bit more general, that focuses more just on the technologies of networking. And you could use this to prepare for the exam, but like I said, the other one is a little bit more focused towards the format of the actual questions. Another thing that a lot of people use is different types of practice questions or practice exams, flashcards. You'll find that there's a couple CDs that are in this book set that go through practice exams. This is going to basically be your very last step in the preparation for the exam. So maybe the week or two before you schedule the exam, go through a couple of these practice exams just to see the formatting of the questions. But you don't want to spend too much time here before you go through the theory. So we're not going to spend a lot of time this week going through practice questions. It's kind of something you can do on your own with these resources that you have available to you. Now the other portion is going to be things that don't really relate specifically to Cisco networking or don't relate to the exam, but are more geared towards just networking in general. Now, the ones that I have on the list here, if you were to read all three of these, it could easily take you 6 months to get through them or more. So a lot of them are really detailed texts, which are kind of like almost like college level texts that are related to networking. But pretty much any of these three, this is something that throughout your career you can always come back to as a reference. And if you look at any of these three, like let's say on like Amazon, the interconnections, bridges and routers, or bridges, routers, and switches. Pretty much all three of those that I have on the list have 5-star ratings anywhere that they sell the book. And you'll see that a lot of them are older texts. I'm not sure where it says this one's from '99 and this is the second edition. But the key is the stuff that these texts cover, they don't change. So it's the same stuff that's been going on in networking for the past 20, 25 years, where like this author, for example, Radia Perlman, she wrote what's known as the Spanning Tree Protocol Algorithm, or STP. So this is one of the topics that we're going to be talking about this week. But the key is that she wrote this book about switching, and every switch that runs Ethernet runs this protocol that she wrote. So pretty much she's the expert on what this is. The same is going to be true with the other two, the internetworking with TCP/IP and TCP/IP Illustrated. These two authors, one of them is Douglas Comer, and the other one I can't remember offhand. Let's see, internetworking with TCP/IP. And I'll get everyone a copy of these slides afterwards, so you don't necessarily have to write all the like the books and stuff down. This one here is really good, which talks just about the general theory of TCP and the general theory of IP. We'll go into a lot of specifics of this this week. But this is part of a series where this one just says, what's the general theory behind IP networking? What are the protocols that make up what we call the IP stack or the TCP/IP stack? From here, he goes on to a couple more books, which are the actual implementation, like from programming code, how do you write IP for my web client in order to talk to your web browser? So depending on where you want to go, like in your career of networking or in the field, if you were to get into actually designing applications and designing programming, then there's a lot more detail that goes into this, the volume 2 and the volume 3. In this case, server programming and applications, BSD socket version. So this means, like, how do you actually implement IP on Linux or Unix? Same is going to be true of the other one, which is TCP/IP illustrated. TCP illustrated, which is by this gentleman, Richard Stevens. So he has another set that's similar. The first book just talks about what are the protocols that make up IP. So what's the theory behind them? What are they supposed to do? Then the ones beyond this go into the actual implementation, so like the programming logic behind IP. And then further than that, transactions, this is like the applications. HTTP would be for web servers. This one is for time. This is network time protocol. Right, and actually NTP, that is for network news. But the key is that these three in general are kind of like the Bibles that come along with IP networking. So you wouldn't necessarily have to read all three of them, but if you pick up one of them, you can always use it as a reference throughout your career. And for a lot of the details that you would want to know, like we'll talk about today in the OSI model, what are the different, what are called the packet data units or the protocol data units that make up like Ethernet versus IP. If you wanted to see actually what does that look like from a programming point of view, these books would be the type of resources that would use. So that level of detail we're not going to get into. We don't need to look at, what does an IP packet look like? What does an Ethernet packet look like? There's tons of resources that you can see after class to go through that. But keep these in mind. Once you go through the general Cisco Press stuff, if you want to get more information on it, then I would definitely recommend to go through at least one of these three. Okay, we'll also spend some time going through what's some of the technology information that's available on Cisco's website. So if you go to Cisco's main website, one of the main sections is here under support. This is where a lot of the product documentation that they have is, and a lot of the general technology documentation. So if you were to go to support and then go down to the bottom of the page here, there's a link that says configure. Now I'm not going to go through all of the details of this right now, but as we go through different topics, like as we get to IP routing, as we get to layer 2 switching, this here is where Cisco documents how do you use all of their products and how do you use all of the technologies within the scope of their specific implementation. So how they do OSPF routing versus how another vendor does, or how they do LAN switching versus how someone else does. But this is going to be a lot of good examples of how would you configure something, how would you test that it's working, or under the technology here, like let's say LAN switching, for example. Technology, LAN switching, then Ethernet. All Ethernet, and then all technology information. So from here you'd find a lot of links that go to external resources. Like in the case of running gigabit Ethernet over copper interfaces, this is defined by a standard that is known as 802.3ab. So if you wanted to see the actual specification of how does running this protocol over this particular type of media different than its other variations, you'll see that this is one place that you can go for a lot of these links. So you wouldn't necessarily read any of this end to end. you'll see it's just massive, the amount of technology documentation that's on Cisco's website. But the key is that if you know how to get through some of these pages, then you may be able to find some of the answers that aren't as clear in some of these books or some of the other resources that we're going through. So as we get to the specifics of these different protocols, we'll go through the technology documentation. So a couple key things that it's going to show. One is going to be frequently asked questions, which talks about what are some of the common problems that people run into in the field. If I'm implementing LAN switching, what are the common problems I need to look out for? And then what are the ways that I can get around this? Same is going to be true of like IP routing, the different IP routing protocols. The other one is going to link to different types of standards. Like I mentioned before, the gigabit Ethernet was defined by 802.3 AD, or actually AB, I believe it was. But these may be some of the questions they would ask you in the exam. What's the standard number for gigabit Ethernet? What's the standard number for gigabit Ethernet over copper? Okay, this is the type of stuff that practice questions are going to cover. We're not really going to spend a lot of time trying to memorize stuff like this week. Okay, you'll also see they go through design guides, which there's a couple that we're going to look at when we get to the LAN switching and then also the routing, that are good to kind of give you an overall picture of how does everything fit in together. So why would I want to use OSPF versus EHRP, or why would I want to use these particular variations of layer 2 networking versus layer 3 networking? And even if you don't get into all the nitty-gritty details behind the individual technologies, it's just a good umbrella to figure out, what's the overall idea of why you would want to use this in the first place. Okay, we'll also spend some time going through the actual product documentation that talks about how do you actually configure these different features in the routers, how do you configure them in the switches. This is going to be made up of a couple different portions that we'll go through. The mainly two portions we'll look at. One is called the configuration guides, one is called the command reference, where configuration guide says if I want to implement a DHCP server, this is the individual steps you need to go through in order to do that. Where the command reference would say, if you issue this specific command, this is what it's going to do, and then these are the different options that you can change on it. So they'll have different uses depending on exactly what we're trying to accomplish, but the more familiar that you get with the configuration guide and the command reference, a lot of questions you'll be able to answer yourself just by going through the number of different documentations that they have. So some of the other portions, like the master index release notes, we'll talk about that later when we get to the specifics of them. So the main thing is that everyone's going to have access to equipment, and that's where we're going to be doing most of our discussion, is on the Cisco iOS command line, on the switches command line. We're going to look at how to go through the different configurations, what are the actual end results of that, how do we test it, and then how does this fit into some of the theory. So as a supplement to the topics that I'm going through, you're still going to need to read a lot of the material that's related to this, which is where this certification library is going to come in, the printed books.